Well, good morning. So we are in the midst of the minor prophets. We have a couple more to go. And it's at this point where we are dealing with a couple of prophets that likely none of you have ever read and probably didn't even know existed, which has been the case for most of the time. But Haggai is a bit of a change of pace. The last prophet we were in was dealing with Israel right before they went into exile. And then all of a sudden, we're going to fast forward almost 100 years later. And so the tone and the way that this goes down is going to be a little bit different. If you've been around Redemption Church for a little while, you're used to around this part of the year, we do a fall kickoff and we start a new series, and we are going to do that, but we're going to do that in September. We want to do a block party, and we want to invite the community. We want you to invite your friends, and we want it to feel a little bit more like fall than right now does. But also, we will start a new series in September about who we are and what we are doing. But for today, I want to lead us into our conversation over Haggai with a question. Have you ever been disappointed by your faith? I want that to sit with you for a moment, because you've grown up in certain circles. That might be a not okay question to even ask. That question itself might be threatening. But I think it's a question that God can absolutely handle. And two, I think a question that we ought to honestly ask ourselves, because many of us in this room, maybe even most of us in this room, have been let down by a church, a tradition, or even a religious leader. Some of us have not just been let down, we've been harmed and abused. Maybe the certainty that you once had in a younger, much more exuberant and vibrant part of your life is gone. And now in its place, you have this unraveling theological spool, and all that you have left in your hand is this big knotted up pile of yarn. You don't really know where to turn. You feel adrift. You feel lost. You don't know what to cling to, what to believe. If that's you, I want you to know I'm glad you're here. This is a safe place for you to carry around your knotted up spool of yarn, and we will carry our knotted up spools of yarn together. Maybe some of you have had some sort of amazing religious experience in the past. You had a great church community back home or in college, and everything since then has paled in comparison. And you just keep wanting to try and get back to that place, that moment, that camp high, that mountaintop, that sense of togetherness. Everything seemed good and right and beautiful and easy. Or maybe, like me, you just expected something a little bit different from your faith. You've done all the right things. You've prayed the prayers. You've ticked all the right boxes. You go to church, you give, you serve, and yet things have gone different than what you've wanted or expected. And if you're like me, things have not just gone differently, things have gone drastically differently than what you expected. I remember finding myself in this spot years ago. I devoted my life to serving God. I had a religious experience. I was on the cusp of deciding I wanted to end my life. And rather than doing that, I made the decision, well, I've already screwed my life up this much. What do I have to lose? Let me just absolutely go all in on this God thing. At the age of 20, I then devoted myself to Beth Moore's women's Bible studies in my bedroom on Friday nights. This is the height of 21-year-old masculinity. I decided to go to Bible college and then on to seminary. I then pursued a lucrative life of full-time ministry. Thank you for laughing. There are some places where that's not actually a joke. I had given my life to God. And it wasn't an implicit expectation, but there was underneath the surface this kind of understanding that I had with God, because I found myself several years into this endeavor with so much in my life that I valued and cared about, good things, wholesome things being taken from me and from my wife. We had really, really good friends that lived literally across the pool from us that were taken from us, a friendship that was lost, community that was lost, siblinghood that was lost. Around this same time, my wife had to have major hip surgery, which meant we had to move out of our hip, cool, super awesome place in Montrose that is now a mid-rise filled with yuppies By the way, we later moved right back into that mid-rise that was built in that place's place. And ironically, the place was called The Place. Look at that. Anyways, so we moved from Montrose out to the bastion of all mid-20s-ness, which is Katy, Texas. And more than that, we didn't just move into Katy, Texas. Yeah, shout out to Katy, Texas. We also moved out to Katy, Texas and moved in with my mom. Yeah, that's right. Let's go. Living the millennial dream. Yeah. So here I was on my 30th birthday in my mother's living room, the place where my wife and I now lived, while all of my peers were busy buying houses and having kids. My wife and I were grappling with significant health issues, a loss of community and connection, no real church, and we were beginning what we did not know at the time, but would become a very long and painful battle with infertility. And I remember one day it all came to a head, and I was just mad, if I can use polite church language, at God. I remember saying to God, it would be easier for me if you didn't exist. Like, let me go. I don't want to give my life to you anymore. This is awful. I gave it all to you, and this is what I get in return? Are you kidding me? I wonder if you've ever found yourself in that sort of, really? Is this it, God? Kind of place. I wonder if you find yourself there today. Maybe you found that your present reality pales in comparison to what you once had. Maybe you find that your present reality pales in comparison to what you expected from God. I also want you to know you're in good company. Because you're with me. No, just kidding. That's not actually why we're in good company. The book of Haggai is very short. I recommend you all read it. It's really short. It's the first book that you really get some real gritty, earthy historicity in the sense that like Haggai's not just going to name like a general period of time. He's going to nail down like specific days of the month of the year. And he does this 4 times with 4 different oracles. And we find in the book of Haggai what ought to have been this joyous, amazing occasion was filled with religious disappointment. After almost 100 years of exile, of borderline enslavement, they were allowed to be their own people, have their own culture, but they had to do it in Babylon, away from their land, and most importantly, away from their temple. Babylon was liberated by Cyrus. I'm going through puberty this morning. I don't know. Y'all should thank me. My bar mitzvah will be next weekend. We'll all celebrate. You can bring gifts. They've been liberated by Babylon, by the Persian king Cyrus. There's this really fun kind of Game of Thrones-esque storyline, but Cyrus accidentally, like his son who becomes king is like king for like 2 or 3 years, and he accidentally stabs himself with a sword. And it's like because of that, while he's getting on his horse, he dies of that wound. And someone who sees this is like, I see an opportunity here. And so he then runs and kills that next in line king and is like, no, it's fine. I killed him. I actually did everyone a favor because he was really a witch who was pretending to be the king. And so thank you. You're welcome. I'll now be king. And so Darius takes over as the king of Persia. And it's in this place where this Cyrus's decree of like, hey, go back to your land and go rebuild your temple, rebuild your city. This is the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. Go in there, reestablish all the things that make you, was in limbo. Because here's this new king, Darius, whose claim was in threat, who is like, yeah, Cyrus, everything that guy said. Yeah, absolutely. Because he's trying to establish his claim. But Haggai recognizes like, hold on, this is all really shaky ground. And so we really ought to get a move on here and get started. And what happens at the beginning of Haggai is Haggai calls the people out for misplaced priorities. They had left Babylon, which is a good thing, and they'd gone back into Judah, which is a good thing, and they'd begun to build not God's house, but their own house. And that wasn't necessarily the problem. It was the underlying misplaced priorities that led them to that. See, the reality is they were convinced that God wasn't really up to much in their time and place. Things were just kind of meh. I don't know, we're back here, but like this isn't what it used to be. This is just kind of like ho-hum whateverness. So I guess we'll devote ourselves to building a nice little life that looks a lot like Babylon here in Judah. They became inattentive to what God might be up to in their midst, to what God was up to in their midst. And in response to the people's inattentiveness, Haggai calls them out. And it's clear that what God wants from his people in this time and in this place is not to build your houses, but to build mine. Rebuild the temple. Devote yourself to this act of faithfulness that's been set in front of you. There's a real unique opportunity that I have placed here. And they are tasked with rebuilding the central religious artifact of Israel. Now, we scoff at religion. It's nice to scoff at religion. We like to punch down at religious folk and religious ideas. And yet, the idea that we should not be religious is itself a religious idea. And I won't get into the philosophy of all of that, but the reality is you are worshiping something in a certain way. The question is not, are you worshiping something in a certain way? The question is, what are you worshiping, and what is the way you are worshiping? The temple was God's visible symbol of God's presence, not just with Israel, but with the entire world. What the Israelites who had gone back to Judah misunderstood was they thought, oh, this is a nice little thing that is for us that we can kind of maybe get to at some point. But what God is saying through Haggai is no, you don't understand. This isn't even about you. This is about the cosmos, and I am with the world. I need you to help them see that. Build the temple. And so in response to the God who speaks, they got to work. And we see this in chapter 2. In chapter 2, in verse 1, we're told, on the 21st of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came by Haggai, the prophet, saying, speak now to Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel would have been the Judite lineage king. So he's next in line to be king. That lineage had been taken from whoever it was before. It's being given back here in Haggai at the very end. The son of Shealtiel, or that guy, as Jordan calls him, governor of Judah. And Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, who is the high priest, and to the remnant of the people, say this: who is here left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And how do you see it now? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? So here they are, they've listened, they've obeyed, they've done what they're supposed to do, they've rebuilt the temple, and they're all like, oh, this is kind of awful. And maybe even some of them were young enough to have seen the original before it was destroyed. And they're like, this thing over here is not that thing that we had back here. And the result of their work was disappointing. The temple paled in comparison to its former glory, Solomon's temple. It's not what they expected. In fact, it wasn't even not what they were expecting. It was far worse than what they were expecting. It was disappointing. And so Haggai says this in verse 4, take courage. Zerubbabel, declares the Lord, take courage. Also Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and all you people of the land, take courage, declares the Lord, and work, for I am with you. I am with you. The whole point of the temple was to be a visible sign of God's presence. The people already had the thing that they needed. They didn't need an amazing, glorious, gold-plated temple like Solomon. They had the very presence of God. So take courage. I am with you, declares the Lord of armies. I do wonder if we run the risk of measuring God's presence against our expectations. If God is really with us, then this will surely happen, right? There are two ways that we've come to measure whether or not Jesus is with us and for us. In the modern world, I think we've been discipled to believe and have therefore come to expect that following Jesus is primarily about right ideas or beliefs, and or primarily about certain types of religious experiences or emotions. right? There's nothing wrong with right ideas and beliefs. We are all about that. We love theological exploration. However, to mistake religious ideas and beliefs for God's presence is a mistake. I am all for religious experiences. I think they are real. I think they're authentic. However, I also think that they are unique. I don't think we live in the midst of ecstatic religious experience all the time. And yet, so many of us in the United States of America have come to measure God's witness in terms of our religious experience, good or bad. We have come to associate God's presence with our right belief, with our religious experience, with our emotional sense of God's witness. And this has led us to place a very high value on certainty, right? And many of us have come from camps that this was the thing. They would draw really clear borders and build fences and walls around this idea of certainty. And to even ask a certain question about the certainty was to have you on the outside of that community. But what we take with us is we carry with us this kind of built-in subconscious voice that says, look, the more certain I am, the harder I must believe. That means the better follower of Jesus I am. So that I mistake Bible study for communion. I mistake learning more theology for witness. I love theology. I love Bible study. Like these are avenues for experiencing God's presence, but they are not God. We think the more we know about Jesus, the more we know Jesus. I remember it rocked my world in one of those Beth Moore Bible studies when she made the very simple but very profound point that there's a difference between believing in God and believing God. Between knowing facts about God and actually walking with God. To knowing about the God I trust, to actually trusting God. The more I believe, the more God will be with me. This leaves no room for doubt. It leaves no room for questions. It leaves no room for something like deconstruction or unknowing, and we subconsciously believe that if we begin to let go or question certain beliefs, then we are somehow beyond God's love and beyond God's saving. And many of you in this room who are pulling at threads of questions and trying to get it like, I don't know, I really don't know if I hold this like I used to hold it anymore. I need you to hear God loves you. God is with you. God is okay with your doubt. God can handle your questions. But there's another uniquely evangelical feature that we have brought in, some baggage, if you will. And that is our prioritizing emotional encounters with God's presence. Now, to be sure, I believe that God encounters us in all manner of our human nature, including our emotions. I find it profoundly moving when I'm triggered emotionally by certain things read or prayed or sung, and I equate that with God's presence and nearness with me. So I'm not saying that if we experience God emotionally that we are wrong. What I am saying is we can mistake an emotional experience for God's presence, and probably more important, we can mistake a lack of emotional experience with that must mean God is not near. These are our camp highs. We were trained from a very young age. We're going to get all your energy out all week long, and then on Friday night, that's our decision night. We're going to turn the lights down real low. We're going to play the soft music. We're going to maybe introduce a little bit of fog. And at the end, I want to invite you to give your life. There's one hand right now. I know there's just one hand, right? And if you've been there, you know, and you're like, I guess it's me. I have to be the one hand because no one else is raising their hand. I don't know. Is that God talking? Is this manipulation? I'm not really sure. And true and authentic as these experiences may be, they can easily become the bedrock of how you believe God thinks about you and relates to you. So that when you leave camp, when you leave the mountaintop, when you've moved away from the emotional experience and you're just in the office on a Tuesday, where is God? Well, I've got to muster up. I don't know, I'll put on some Hillsong or KSBJ and leave me alone. I'm trying to be with God right now. Can I just in love point out that both of these are dependent on you? That both of these are dependent on what you do? That both of these assume that God needs you to do fill in the blank so that God can then fill in the blank. Your salvation, your communion, your witness with God depends on your emotional response or your theological intelligence. The good news for all of us this morning is the thing that God has wrought for you in the person of Jesus Christ is God's witness. And there is absolutely nothing you can do to unmake that, to undo that, to damage that, to take that away, to make God change his mind. God has decided in Jesus to be with you. Hear how Haggai puts it. And this was long before Jesus. Hear the heart of God in some of these like scathing words of the minor prophets. In verse 5 of chapter 2, as for the promise which I made when you came out of Egypt, the promise that I made you like 300 years ago, y'all remember that? My spirit remains in your midst. Do not fear. That thing that I did back here, I'm still doing it. I know it doesn't seem like it. I know you're looking around and you're like, really? Is this it? But I'm still at work. I'm still moving. I'm still with you. I am still bringing myself to the entire world, bringing communion. For this is what the Lord of armies says. Once more, in a little while, I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth, the sea also and the dry land. And as this was being read for us this morning, I just immediately went to Golgotha. I immediately went to Jesus' crucifixion. And after Jesus breathes his final breath, the earth shakes and the sun is blotted out from the sky and the graves are opened up and the dead come out. And God's great saving act for all of humanity is done. God is with you. And God's going to be with you when you leave this place. And God's going to be with you when you go to sleep and when you wake up. And God's going to be with you in your final breath. And God's going to be with you on the other side of death. And God's going to be with you in resurrection. God is with you. That means that God is with you even right now in your disappointment, in your discouragement, in your doubt, even in your church hurt, even in the church let me down or didn't live up to your expectations. God's with you-ness, God's communion. This is why Christ has come. This is what Christ is doing for us even now. And this is not something that you can buy or earn or gain or lose. It is yours, given to you by God. And it is the point. And so, God's with you-ness is also God's gift to the world. God's with you is God's gift to them. And we call this church. What God is doing in this time and in this place in Jesus Christ is building his temple on earth. As the New Testament says, we, community, we, ecclesia, we, gathering, are the spirit-filled temple of God. It's not made with brick and mortar. It is made with people. God's with you-ness is God's presence in the world, the place in which he dwells. This is the church. Now, I know many of us struggle with this. We have lots of very, very, very good reasons to be like, yeah, but hold on. The church has done ... Absolutely. Absolutely. I could tell you my own stories, things that I have done as a pastor and as a follower of Jesus, things that have been done to me by others. I can give you my list of grievances. I want us to hear Haggai one more time, and then I want to make some gentle encouragements to us this morning in this regard. In chapter 2, verse 7, I will shake all the nations, and they will come with the wealth of all nations, and I will fill this house with glory. Notice the actor here. I will do this. I will do this. I will do this. Like, our job here is not to make it happen. Our job is to get caught up in it. But also, I think the wealth of the nations, I read this like the early church reads this. The wealth of the nations that are filling the temple is not silver and gold, my friends. The wealth of the nations filling the temple is you and me. The wealth of the nations are the non-Israelites that are being brought into God's presence. We are the wealth of the nations. We are God's treasure. The silver is mine. The gold is mine, declares the Lord of armies. In the former glory of this house, the one you're looking back to and saying, man, it was so good back then, it's going to be greater than the former, says the Lord of armies. And in this place, I will give peace. And so what Jesus invites us into, what Haggai speaks to the people of Israel, that Jesus speaks to us in the New Testament, that the apostles of Jesus bring out as well, is that in the present, look back to see what God has done. Yes, absolutely. But use it as a way to look forward to see what God will one day do. So that you can know right now, here and now, this is what God is up to. We are not abandoned. God is with us. Now, here's the rub. Take this one up with God. I don't know why he does it this way, but he does this way. This is very anti-American. It's very punk rock, I guess. But God uses institutions. Right, that is to say, God uses groups of people who have been organized in certain ways in order to mediate himself to the world. He uses Abraham, who then turns into a tribe, who then turns into a nation. Out of that nation comes Jesus. Jesus organizes followers who become apostles, who then organize other followers who become the church. This is God's choosing to use us in God's salvation of the world. And so what I'm seeming to say is that God has decided, I'm going to use this messy, broken, sometimes hurtful thing called the church to redeem the cosmos. Because sometimes I use messy, broken, sometimes hurtful people to love the world. So we can operate in our received faith in hope, not pretending that it's perfect, not glossing over toxic, harmful, abusive things, but also with the recognition, hey, we're not perfect, and we ought not expect the church to be perfect. Whether that's Redemption Church or the church with a capital C. But that in it, through it, and often in spite of it, God is with us, and God is still at work bringing about God's redemptive plan. And this is God's work. That's what makes it so sure, is God's work. It's not our work. We participate in what God is up to. We don't have to muster it on our own. So in the midst of what God is doing, even in the midst of disappointment, God is still with you. And God is still at work. And God is still here. In Eugene Peterson's memoir, he notes that after the first 3 years of planning a church, when the excitement had begun to die down, the new had begun to wear off, they had finished building a building and the community was all kind of settled into the routine. He looked up, and Sunday after Sunday, people just started going missing. What for the first 3 years of this growing church, it was buzzing with excitement. All of a sudden after 3 years, just kind of meh. It was well settled. It was established. And he found himself in what he later would call the Badlands. The desert, the wasteland of his community. And this lasted for the next 7 years in that community. The church had stalled out. People were leaving. There was nothing to be excited about any longer. There was no building project. There was no mission they were moving towards. They had stopped living from goal to goal and instead were trudging through the monotonous life of faith. And it was here that Eugene, much to his kicking and screaming, decided to stay. He didn't want to stay. He actually tried to leave. He interviewed, didn't get the job, and realized I guess this is where I'm going to be at. And it's in the midst of this stagnation, this looking around going, really, is this it? That he began to understand what following Jesus looks like here and now. And he calls it a long obedience in the same direction. That just day by day, we're putting one foot in front of the other. Day by day, we're living faithful to Jesus, and whatever opportunity comes to us in that day, we're taking it for what it is. We don't need to go make something happen. And I expect that so much of the Christian life actually really looks like that. There are lots of churches you could go to in this city, spirit-filled, Jesus-loving churches that would probably tell you otherwise. That, hey, here's something to get excited about. Here's an experience that we can have together. But what I want you to hear this morning from your pastor is that it doesn't matter because God is with you. God's with you in the disappointment. God's with you in the emotions or the not emotions. God's with you in the certainty, and God is with you in the doubt. Rather than the God with you that makes everything work out, God is with you in the midst of when everything doesn't work out. And God is not done. That's the key. This isn't it. That's the story we're living into. And so we run the risk, like the Israelites, of assuming that God must not be up to much in this time, in this place. And so we run the risk of becoming inattentive to what God might be doing right in front of us with a coworker, with a neighbor, with the person sitting in the pew next to us, chair, I guess. God's encouragement to us is to be a reminder that we are sent by God to this place and to this time as lights to the world, as embodiments of the hope of Jesus Christ. One of the important parts about the temple is that while the temple housed the presence of God, the temple very obviously and very clearly could not contain God's self. The church, while it does house the presence of God, please be under no misunderstandings. We are not God. The church is not Jesus Christ, and the fullness of Jesus Christ does not dwell and reside within the church. Jesus Christ bursts forth and is at work in all sorts of places that we church folk go, wait, you can't do that. And yet Jesus says, well, I'm God and you're not, so chill. But that for whatever reason, God has chose to be in our midst in this time and in this place in this way. And so our job is to embody that reality and embody that hope by loving God and loving our neighbor. Right here, right now, we're not meant to recreate or live into whatever past glories or mountaintops experiences we once had or whatever we might expect should be now. There's a sign hanging in my office over the desk that was handed down to me by one of our former pastors, Mike. It's a Colossians verse in the Message, which was written by Eugene Peterson. Eugene Peterson wrote the Bible, ha ha ha. It's his translation of the New Testament. And it's this little blurb that reminds me every single day when I bother to look at it. That's why I put it front and center, so I have to look at it. What I'm actually doing as your pastor. And it simply says this at the beginning. God is with you. God is in you. And God is working towards your glory. This is it. This is our message. That's the good news. God is with you. God is in you. And this ensures that you will one day fully partake in God's presence. Maybe today you find yourself disappointed. Maybe you've been hurt. Maybe you're in a tremendous amount of pain or doubt or skepticism. Maybe you keep trying to go back there, wherever there is. a place where faith felt more certain. Things felt easier. Community was easier. You felt so close to God. Maybe you're trying to get back to that mountaintop. Those are not bad places to be. But if you're here in the valley, if you're in the midst of disappointment, if you're in the midst of not there, wherever there is for you, the good news is that Jesus Christ is with you, even here. And what that means is that God is with us.